Imagine waking up one morning, feeling fine. You eat breakfast. You kiss your family. You go to work. And by nightfall, you have a fever so violent it feels like your body is on fire from the inside. The next morning, you wake up with strange, dark swellings under your arms, on your neck, in your groin. They are the size of eggs. They are black and purple, and they are growing. Your family is terrified. Your neighbors will not come near your door. A doctor arrives wearing a strange mask shaped like a bird's beak, filled with herbs and flowers, because he believes the smell will protect him. He looks at you for 30 seconds. He says nothing. He leaves. Within 3 days, you are dead, and so is half your street. This was not a horror story. This was not a movie. This was real life in Europe in the year 1347. And what happened next would permanently and completely change the entire world forever. This is the story of the Black Death. Before we talk about what the Black Death did to the world, we need to understand what the world looked like before it arrived, because the contrast is absolutely staggering. In the early 1300s, Europe was thriving. Cities were growing. Trade was booming. The population had been climbing steadily for centuries. People were building cathedrals that touched the sky. Artists were creating magnificent works. Universities were opening their doors. Life was hard by modern standards, but it was moving forward. It was progressing. And then, everything stopped. The plague did not begin in Europe. It began thousands of miles away in Central Asia, somewhere in the region of modern-day Kyrgyzstan, around the year 1338. Scientists who studied ancient burial sites from that period found evidence of a massive and sudden die-off of people in that region. Inscriptions on tombstones from that time mention a mysterious pestilence, a disease so deadly and so fast that families could not even properly mourn their dead. The disease was caused by a tiny bacterium called Yersinia pestis. It lived inside fleas, and those fleas lived on rats, and those rats traveled everywhere that humans traveled, on ships, on caravans, along trade routes that stretched from China all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. The Silk Road, the greatest trade network in human history, the route that connected civilizations and spread culture and ideas and goods across the entire known world, also became the highway that carried death from one corner of the earth to another. By 1346, the plague had reached the Crimea, on the northern shore of the Black Sea. And this is where one of the most chilling moments in the entire history of warfare took place. A Mongol army was besieging a Genoese trading post called Kaffa. The siege was going badly for the Mongols because their own soldiers were dying of plague by the thousands. So the Mongol commander made a decision that would echo through history for centuries. He ordered his soldiers to load the bodies of plague victims onto catapults and hurl them over the city walls. It was the world's first recorded act of biological warfare. And it worked. The people inside Kaffa began to die. Panicked Genoese merchants fled the city and boarded ships heading west toward the Mediterranean. They were trying to escape, but they brought the plague with them on every single ship. In October of 1347, 12 Genoese trading ships docked in the port of Messina in Sicily. When the harbor officials went to greet the ships, they found something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Most of the sailors on board were already dead. The ones who were still alive were covered in black boils, oozing with blood and pus. They were delirious with fever. They were dying in front of everyone watching from the dock. The officials ordered the ships out of the harbor immediately.
But it was already too late. The plague was on European soil. It spread with a speed that was absolutely terrifying for a world that had no understanding of germ theory, no concept of bacteria, no antibiotics, no public health systems. People had no idea what was killing them or why. They had no idea how it spread. They had no way to stop it. Within months, it had reached mainland Italy, then France, then Spain, then Germany, then England, then Scandinavia. It moved along trade routes, along rivers, along coastlines. It followed humans wherever humans went. There were 3 forms of the plague, and all 3 were horrifying. The first was bubonic plague, the most common form, where the bacteria infected the lymph nodes and caused those terrifying swellings called buboes, from the Greek word for groin. These swellings could grow to the size of an apple. They turned black. They were agonizingly painful. About half of people who got bubonic plague died from it. The second form was septicemic plague, where the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly and caused black patches to appear all over the skin as the tissue underneath died. This is where the name Black Death came from. People who got septicemic plague almost always died, usually within hours. The third form was pneumonic plague, which infected the lungs and spread through the air when sick people coughed or breathed. Pneumonic plague was essentially 100% fatal, and unlike the other forms, it could spread without any flea or rat at all. Just breathing the same air as an infected person was enough. The mortality rate across all forms was catastrophic. In some cities, it killed 60% of the population. In others, it killed 80%. There were villages in France and Italy where literally every single person died, where archaeologists have found mass graves containing hundreds of bodies thrown in together because there were not enough survivors left to give individual burials. Think about that for a moment. An entire village, every man, every woman, every child, gone. By the time the worst of the first wave had passed in 1353, somewhere between 75 million and 200 million people had died. Europe alone lost between 1/3 and 1/2 of its entire population in just 6 years. 6 years! To put that in modern terms, imagine if half of every person alive in Europe today simply vanished. Every second person you pass on the street, gone. Every other family on your block, gone. Half your co-workers, half your classmates, half your city, gone. That is what happened, and the people who survived had to keep living inside that reality every single day. So what did it feel like to live through the Black Death? The accounts that survive from that period are almost impossible to read without feeling something profound. A writer named Giovanni Boccaccio lived through the plague in Florence, Italy, and wrote about what he witnessed. He described a city completely transformed by terror. People abandoned their sick family members in the streets because they were too afraid of catching the disease themselves. Parents left their children. Children left their parents. Husbands fled their wives. Wives fled their husbands. The social bonds that hold human civilization together, family, community, loyalty, love, began to dissolve under the pressure of absolute existential terror. Bodies piled up in the streets because there was nobody left to bury them. Churches that had always been the center of community life stood empty because people were too afraid to gather in groups. Markets closed, schools closed, courts of law closed. The normal machinery of society ground to a halt. And the psychological impact was equally devastating. People who watched everyone around them die began to believe that the world was ending, that God had abandoned them, that there was no point in planning for a future that would never come. Some people responded by becoming extremely religious, praying constantly, flagellating themselves publicly, believing that if they suffered enough, God would spare them. Others responded by doing the exact opposite, abandoning all moral restraint, feasting and drinking and doing whatever they wanted, because tomorrow they might be dead anyway. Both responses make complete psychological sense when you understand the scale of what these people were experiencing. This was not a natural disaster that lasted a few days. This was 6 years of watching the world fall apart around you with no end in sight and no understanding of why it was happening. And then there was the question of blame. When people don't